about the period around World War II in Russia, and of course in the former Soviet Union. It was known as the Great Patriotic War. In 1939, there was a census in the Soviet Union. And according to the census, there were approximately 3,028,000 Jews who lived in the Soviet Union. Of that 3 million, 2.1 million lived in all the parts of the Soviet Union that were captured during the war by the Germans. Between 350,000 to 500,000 Jews served in the Soviet army during the war. And this represents about 18% of the Jews in the USSR. An estimated 200,000 Jews fell in battle at the front. And one thing that was interesting to me is that there were initiatives to establish separate Jewish military formations, but they did not yield any results during the war. Now, I want to read a text. Yad Vashem conducted a project, Jews in the Red Army, many years after the war. And they published, of course, in Hebrew. I have an English translation of part of that. We're going to talk about one soldier, Evel. His name was Evel Beliavan, who was born in 1920 in the town of Barbarossa, Belorussia. His father was a carpenter. Like his three elder brothers, Evel graduated from a Yiddish school. Then he worked as a locksmith. He always wanted to become a pilot. In 1935, he enrolled in courses at a local airfield. In 1938, he was drafted into the Red Army. And a year later, he completed studies at a school for pilots, where he specialized in bombing. Not in embombing, but in dropping bombs. During the war, Evel served as a pilot in the Soviet forces involved in the Battle of the Caucasus and Kursk. Kursk, for those who know their Russian history, was one of the greatest tank battles in the history of the world. His three brothers also served in the Red Army. One of them, Roman, was also a pilot, while the two others, Boris and Yakov, fought in the infantry. In 1944, Evel's squadron was attacked by German jet planes. The plane of his commander was hit, and because of that, it was exposed to further German attack. Evel provided cover to the commander's plane with his own plane and returned the German fire. As a result, his own plane was badly damaged. He thought of parachuting, but his gunner was severely wounded and could not jump. Against all odds, he succeeded in landing his plane. This exploit, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. In all, he logged more than 300 combat flights, ending with the battle for Berlin. In addition to being decorated as Hero of the Soviet Union, he was also awarded several other honors. He retired from the Army in 1972, so he was a career person, rank of colonel. Among Soviet troops was a relatively large number of Jewish women. The majority of them were doctors, nurses, or translators. Often Jewish women were among the medics who evacuated the wounded from the battlefield or served in other units whose members were also in battle zones. And a special category was composed of those Jewish women who participated directly in combat as pilots or navigators in the Soviet Air Force or in artillery units. So that's an interesting sideline. Let's go to September 1st, 1939. That's officially when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. On the 17th of that month, the Red Army crossed the Polish border, ostensibly to protect the lives and properties of West Belorussia and West Ukraine. Stalin told the Red Army Chief Commissar, the Red Star, which was the military paper, makes frequent allusions to fascists and fascism. Stop doing that. There's no need for Hitler to get the impression that we were only planning a war against him. So what does that tell you? One of the things that tells me as a historian is that at that point, Stalin did not expect an attack from Hitler on the Soviet Union and was doing everything he could not to antagonize Hitler. Remember, they had an armistice. And part of that armistice was a secret clause in the armistice that allowed the Soviet Union to invade Poland. So that was all known to both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union issued a decree that citizenship would be granted to all citizens of the territory they invaded on the day of annexation. Acceptance of Soviet citizenship was voluntary. People could choose to hold on to their Polish citizenship. But the Soviets arrested many people in the areas incorporated from Poland on the charge of possible espionage or belonging to counter-revolutionary organizations or for counter-revolutionary activities. As many as 590,000 Polish citizens were estimated to be in the Soviet Union in 1941, 20% of them Jews. These included Red Army conscripts, those who moved to the interior of Russia to work, those who moved to Russia to escape the Nazis. That does not include those who were arrested. The number of arrested was estimated at 71,000. The bottom line was the 21 months of Soviet rule in Poland was a disillusioning experience for most Jews. Factories owned by Jews were confiscated. Kehilot and all Zionist organizations were abolished. The entire Polish Jewish education system was disbanded and replaced by state schools. All existing Jewish newspapers were banned, and only one new paper, the Bialystoker Stern, was allowed to open, and that exclusively served a communist ideology. At the same time, there was an increase in anti-Semitism, particularly in Poland and Lithuania. Polish and Lithuanian nationalists exaggerated the Jewish participation in the new system. And any Jewish participation in the new system would be called out by these nationalists because the presence of any Jews in the apparatus of government was basically unprecedented, particularly in Lithuania, and was seen as an overturning of the natural order. On December 18, 1940, Directive 21 was issued by the High Command of the German Armed Forces, the OKW. This was Operation Barbarossa. The objective of the operation was to destroy the Soviet Union as a communist state, together with its regime. So what do we know by this directive? Well, first of all, we knew from the very beginning the objective of Nazi Germany was to link Jews to the Bolshevist regime and to make sure that both were destroyed in the German invasion. A March 13th, 1941 OKW directive authorized the Einsatzgruppen and other SS units to carry out operations against civilian populations in area under military control. So that we know at least from March 13, 1941, that there was a directive that was issued in Germany to carry out operations against civilian populations. At the beginning of the occupation, German authorities forced the Jewish councils to collect large sums of money and pass that money on to them. Members of the council or other groups of Jews were arrested and held hostage to ensure successful collection of the levy. The military administration ordered all males aged 14 to 60 and all females 16 to 50 subject to forced labor. Ghettos were established simultaneously with the beginning of the annihilation of the Jews. So remember, the Nazi plan to annihilate the Jews of Poland and, of course, later on in Russia was a step-by-step plan. It started, like I said, with the liquidation of all Jewish monies, forced labor, then the ghettos, and when the ghettos were established, the beginning of the annihilation of the Jews. Now, what were the reactions of the local population to German occupation? Opinions regarding the Germans and their policy towards the Jews was partly hostile, mostly indifferent. Attitudes depended on the strength of anti-Semitism before the German invasion, which was widespread, especially in the Baltic states. Also, the power of nationalism. Many locals initially saw Germans as liberators from the Soviet occupation. It was also dependent on the German policy towards indigenous people. It's very interesting. Remember that Nazism is a racist-based ideology. And therefore, the Nazis had a different opinion about the various groups who they occupied in the Soviet Union. Groups such as the Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians were considered to be more Aryan and were, according to the German racist ideology, salvageable. In the end, that they could be salvaged and become part of a new German order in Eastern Europe. But the Poles, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians were considered Slavs and slave people at best. There was also a plan to annihilate a huge portion of them as well. And the ones that weren't annihilated, they were made into slaves to serve the German people. Other reactions of the local population depended on property. Homes and property were appropriated by members of the local population. They hoped to avoid Jewish return after the war. Also, it's interesting that Jews received no organized help from local groups or local anti-German underground groups, only from individuals. I want to read a text from Vasily Grossman. Vasily Grossman was a great Russian Jewish writer of that time who wrote several books that are published and have been published in England in new translations, including Life and Fate and Stalingrad. The character that Vasily Grossman is portraying in the novel is based on the author's mother, who stayed behind in Berdichev, Ukraine, to look after her. She continued to work there even after the Jews were confined to the ghetto. This is from the novel. Vitya, I'm certain this letter will reach you, even though I'm now behind the German front line, behind the barbed wire of the Jewish ghetto. This morning, I was reminded of what I'd forgotten during the years of the Soviet regime, that I was a Jew. Some Germans drove past on a lorry shouting out, Juden, kaput. I got a further reminder from some of my own neighbors. The caretaker's wife was standing beneath my window, saying to the woman next door, well, that's the end of the Jews. Thank God for that. What could have made her say that? Her son's married to a Jew. The woman next door came around and said to me, Anna Semnovia, I'm moving into your room. Can you clear your things out by evening? I'll move into your room then. When I came back, I found the door of my room had been smashed in and all my things piled in the little room behind the kitchen. My neighbor said, "I've kept a settee for myself. There's no room for you. There's no room for it where you are now." Now, Grossman is a communist. He was also a writer for the Red Star, which I had previously mentioned was the Red Army newspaper, like the Stars and Stripes is in the United States. He's writing this as a Jew, and to me the most significant line is, "This morning I was reminded of what I'd forgotten during the years of the Soviet regime, that I was a Jew." Let's talk a little bit about Jewish armed resistance in the ghettos. The idea of fighting against the Nazis came very late, and it came as a result of the awareness that the Nazis had sentenced the Jews to total annihilation, and it was better to die fighting. Also, it was hoped that a ghetto uprising would open the way for an escape to the forests to take up guerrilla warfare. Undergrounds were organized in Minsk, Vilna, Kaunas, Riga, all the ghettos there. Why do you think that there was not armed uprising by the Jews earlier? Anybody have any ideas? Well, I'll give you some reasons why. First of all, the Germans had a policy of overwhelming retaliation against any uprisings by Jews, or for that matter, Poles or other groups, but particularly against Jews. Any uprising by Jews would have been met with collective punishment, severe collective punishment. In one or two cases, there were uprisings by Jews that killed individual Nazis. The Nazis would pick out 10 to 20 people in the ghetto and summarily execute them. So this was one discouragement. Another discouragement was lack of weapons. Weapons were very hard to come by, and the anti-Nazi Poles, Ukrainians, and other groups were basically unwilling to share their weapons with Jewish partisans. And there's a number of cases in which Jewish partisan groups who escaped the ghetto and went to the forests and brought the weapons with them that they had seized and came to partisan groups. Their weapons were seized by those partisan groups, and the Jews were left without weapons. Let's talk about Jewish partisans a little bit. In Latvia and Lithuania, the locals were so hostile that they prevented Soviet partisans from establishing strongholds in the forests. Jews, all the more so. Some Soviet partisans were unwilling to Jewish people in ranks. All Jewish partisan units were formed, including one that liberated the Kosovo ghetto in August 1942. On the whole, Jewish armed resistance in the forest and in the ghetto was active on a much wider scale than anywhere else in Europe. I'm going to read a text by Yitzhak Arad about the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Yitzhak Arad is one of the great scholars of the Holocaust. The Soviet Union followed a deliberate propaganda policy dictated by Stalin. And that was obvious from his very first wartime speech. The German aim was to annihilate the Russians and other Slavic people, which was not true. And to hide the fact, that Nazi Germany carried out total annihilation only of the Jews and not of any other nation in the occupied territories. In millions of leaflets distributed along the Soviet front and in the rear area, the German propaganda machine stressed that its war was against Judeo-Bolshevism and not against the Russian people and the other nations in the Soviet Union. To counter this propaganda, the Soviet authorities presented Germany as striving to exterminate the Russians and other Slavic nations, while downplaying the murder of Jews and their singular fate under German occupation. Anything that did not contribute directly to the war effort, to the victory over Nazi Germany, was of no interest to Stalin. I want to repeat these last two sentences to you and discuss them very briefly. Anything that did not contribute directly to the war effort, to the victory over Nazi Germany, was of no interest to Stalin. Jewish historians have pointed out that it wasn't only Stalin who felt this way. It was also Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. There were numerous instances of Churchill and FDR in particular being asked to, at least if nothing else, bomb the railroad tracks that led to Auschwitz. And he declined, saying that he cannot divert the planes, the bombs, and the risk of the pilots being lost to divert from the total war effort and victory over Nazi Germany. So in this, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR were all the same. The fate of the Jews was not of interest to them. Now, ethnic deportations in the Soviet Union is a piece of history that many people do not know about. Ethnic deportations in the Soviet Union didn't happen until 1943-44. Why up until that time? Why not until that time? Let's put it that way. Anybody have any ideas?
I think maybe the Russians still counted on many of the Jews to be part of the Red Army.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about more widespread ethnic deportations in the Soviet Union. Okay, remember for several classes we've been talking about multi-ethnic Soviet Union, correct?
Yes.
Okay. 1943, the tide of battle had turned in the Soviet Union. The Red Army was on the offensive. The Germans were pushed back from Stalingrad and Moscow. The Soviet Union was advancing and beginning to liberate territory that was occupied by the invasion. Now, in those areas, many people had been forced to collaborate with the Nazis or had done so out of conviction. Many of those young people who lived in those areas had evaded recruitment into the Red Army. Stalin was worried that these non-Russian ethnics were tainted by the occupation. And the means of clearing that tainting of the people would be accomplished by mass repression. This was based on Stalin's idea of collective responsibility for collaboration with the occupiers. So once again, we have this idea of collective responsibility. In this, Stalin was no different than Hitler. The outcome was deportation of a number of Soviet ethnic groups, including the Chechens, the Kalmyks, the Ingush, Crimean Tatars, all Bulgarian, Greeks, and Armenians living in Crimea, a total of 1 million people. Let's talk about the Jewish losses. They range between 1 to 1.3 million. In the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 90% of the pre-war Jewish population were murdered or killed. In Belarusia, about 66%. In the Ukraine, about 60%. In Russia proper, about 100,000 Jews. Now, one thing that is interesting, at the end of the war, when Jews, the few Jews that were left, began to return home, especially in the Ukraine, when they moved to where they lived before and attempted to reclaim their apartments or property, they were subject to anti-Jewish disturbances and individual attacks. As we'll see in the next class, this became a problem, particularly in the Ukraine. And the Soviet Union had to deal with anti-Semitism in the Ukraine post-World War II. Okay, any questions?
I have a question. Because of the obvious anti-Semitism in places like Ukraine and Latvia and Lithuania, what was the motivation of Jews to return to those areas when they knew they were going to face the same anti-Semitism they had before?
Good question. I think it was a mixture from everything that I've read. One is, where else at that point were you going to go? There were, the DP camps were not set up until after the war was over. Okay? So what choices did the Jews have before the end of the war? You could either go into the Soviet hinterlands or attempt to go back to where you were before. So there wasn't much of a choice.
Yeah.
I think that that's the best answer that I can give you. Also, I don't think that a lot of Jews realized, or even, they had suffered incredibly.
Mm-hmm.
But so had the rest of the population too. Not as, of course, as much as the Jews. But you think those who suffer with you know what suffering is, what loss is, that they would be sympathetic to who you were and what you had undergone. And that's rarely the case, even though we take that for granted that that's going to be the case. That doesn't usually play out in history.
I have a comment, please.
Good question.
So in 1939, when World War II broke out in September, soon after, my parents left Poland to go to Russia.
I have one question, Rochelle, before you continue. In what section of Poland do you know, if you know, were they living?
Yeah, they were living in Międzyrzec Podlaski, which was about an hour and a half away from Warsaw.
East or west?
It was west.
Okay, so they were living.
So they were living in Międzyrzec Podlaski, and quite a few Jewish families realized that staying in Poland at that point would be more dangerous actually than going to Russia, where they knew anti-Semitism existed as well. It wasn't as if they were so naive and thought that that was some kind of an Eden
Right.
that they were going to. But the one thing that they knew, they were not going to be wholesale murdered like they were in Poland if they remained. So they stayed there. They went through, let me see, Brześć, Buk Podlaski. They went through, they went first there, and then we ended up, well, I wasn't there yet, but then they ended up in Krasnodar, Krasnodarski Kraj, which is Kuban, in the Ural Mountains. And that's where they stayed for the entire war. Now, my parents' memories of that was that they were not treated any differently than anybody else. Everybody was suffering, quite obviously. So they did not feel any special attention to them being Jewish. So anti-Semitism wasn't an issue during that period for them. Of course, in 1945, when World War II was over, they were told to go back to Poland. And they did, but Poland did not resettle them back in the same areas, but rather they returned them to Dolny Śląsk, which is the Lower Silesia,
Right.
because that's
Former
where they
German.
captured,
Right.
they recaptured territories from the Germans.
From Germany. Right.
Right. And so in essence, and that was, when I look at it today, when I was born right after the war. So when I look at it today, my parents were resettled in apartments that were abandoned by Germans. These apartments were fully furnished, including with every last item that you can imagine a household needs to have. Kind of bizarre, I can tell you.
Yeah.
When I think about it today. But anyway, so that's our story.
That's a great story. And it's all, yes. The Poles, the Czechs, the Russians, basically after World War II, we talk about expulsions during the war. And after the war, I don't remember the exact number of Germans. These weren't Germans who came, for the most part, and settled during the war. These were Germans who had lived in this area, some of them, many of them, for generations. They were expelled. Basically, all Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and from Western Russia after the war, became refugees, and most of them settled in post-World War II Germany. And that's another interesting, history is so interesting because most of us, don't study history very closely and don't realize how many things we don't learn in history classes. There were groups in Germany up until basically the late 50s or early 60s. These were Germans who had come back to Germany who sought some solution for being expelled from Russia, Poland, and the Czechoslovakia. And of course, there was no restitution given. They didn't win any. And basically, they didn't receive any encouragement from either the East German or the West German governments to keep up their fight to get restitution. But yeah, that was a movement in Germany after World War II. Any other questions, comments?
Can I ask Rochelle what caused her parents to leave Poland later? Was it the and where did they go? How did they get here?
So 1939, of course, World War II broke out in September. And early on, Germans started moving into the towns because they were supposed to be peaceful. It was supposed to be a peaceful takeover, correct? Well, of course, it wasn't to be. They settled in several townships around Międzyrzec Podlaski, and they started evicting people from their homes because they needed quarters to stay. Their soldiers needed places where they could be. So they started removing them from their houses. And my parents were very poor, so it wasn't exactly like they lived in a palace and they were ejected from that. So there was no fear that they would be ejected. But slowly things started disintegrating. Then at the end of September, the Germans decided to bomb. And when the bombs started falling, my father and most of his brothers decided that they would leave and not wait to see what happens, because rumors had already started about people, because Warsaw was so close, and news was, they were able to hear the news from Warsaw, how Jews were being rounded up. And they were being resettled and sent to work camps. So they decided to load up what they had. And actually in the beginning, it was horse and buggies and then trains. My mom was expecting my sister. And when they arrived in, Brest, when they arrived in Brest, that's where my sister was born. And my daddy's brothers, all of them actually, did the same thing. My mom's older two brothers decided that they were staying, and they did not survive.
No,
Thank you.
8,000 Jewish people. 8,000 Jewish people. There's a monument in Mezrich today, which I visited not very long ago, to the memory of the 8,000 who remained and were rounded up and were all taken to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen.
but no, Rochelle, I was talking about after the war. You said they left Russia, went back to Poland, lived.
Right, that was they were asked.
What happened after that? Because did you come to America?
No, so this it's a long story. I need a whole class on that. But okay, now so in essence, in 1946. They were returned to Dolny Śląsk, Lower Silesia, and they stayed there until Bierut came to power in Poland. And he decided at that point that Jews really had no place in Poland at this point. And he told them, you want to go? Go. So the immigration to Israel started around 1956 in Poland. And that's how we immigrated from Dzierżoniów, Dolny Śląsk, to Israel in 1957. So we were actually told to leave. We were told go, but some people still stayed, and the later immigration was. I was under the impression that 1957 had 56, 57 had a huge immigration from Poland. It turns out when I read about it recently that it was a mere 25,000 people. I mean, there were not that many Jews left over at this point, right? So there were not that many people. And then in between 1957, it was relatively quiet. And then in 1963, the second wave of Polish Jews left. And at that point, I believe the Jews who remained at Poland after that were actually in the maybe a few thousand.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Rochelle.
Sure.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Okay, any last questions or comments? Well, I want to thank you all for coming to class this morning. Wish you all a happy Father's Day, for those of you who are celebrating. And we'll see you here next week. And once again, thanks to Jennifer.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy Father's Day.
Thank you. You too.